Okay, hello everyone and welcome to Concordia University's Fourth Space. Thank you for joining us for today's event, Listening Beyond, Conversations with Activists. It's a podcast launch, it's also a panel. To help situate you, we are streaming to YouTube, live from Fourth Space, and we are located here on unceded Indigenous lands in Tiohtià:ke, Montreal. And here at Fourth Space, we work with the university community to help mobilize knowledge. We co-create daily activities that examine research questions, projects, things in development across the university. And we're running today's event as a live stream Zoom meeting also. So those of you joining us there, we welcome your comments and questions via the chat. We can read those out during the Q&A. And those of you here with us in the space, same, if you have any comments or questions during the Q&A, just raise your hand. We'll bring a microphone over to you. Now, this event was organized by the students of the School of Community and Public Affairs course, SCPA 352. It's now my pleasure to pass things over to Principal and Associate Professor in the School of Community and Public Affairs, Professor for the course, Anna Schaftel. Anna, great to have you.
Thank you. Thank you, Doug. I'm so pleased to be here, and I had put this in my notes, but I'll say it up front. I have to say this event was organized almost entirely by our students, which speaks to the amazing work that happened in this course. I'm not going to talk for too long, but I did want to start by introducing SCPA for anyone who's not familiar with it. So the School of Community and Public Affairs is a very small interdisciplinary school that brings together sort of students of diverse backgrounds whose common interest is wanting to change their communities, to change the world, whether that's on the community level, on the policy level, et cetera. And so this course, SCPA 352, Community and Local Activism, is one of our courses that is more focused on the community level, and I've taught it for 4 years now. And every year, we have centered the class on a collective oral history project in which students interview activists of their choosing about their lives and their work. And key to the way we approach activism in the class is thinking about how hard it is actually to learn about activism in a classroom setting, because it's about doing, it's about being out in the world. And so we talk a lot about bridging theory and practice, and this project is a really wonderful way of doing that because, you know, we talk about all these big ideas in the classroom, and then students spend the semester also really immersing themselves in the life story of one activist of their choosing. So it's a student-led project. For 4 years now, students have had the choice of what kind of project they want to do, and they've chosen to continue this podcast because it's got this nice continuity now. They've done much of the organizing around it. So like I said, this launch was almost entirely organized by students that I nicknamed the Keener Committee, who were amazing. And so it's a really nice opportunity to highlight that student work, which I think goes far beyond the expectations of a 3-credit course. I ask a lot of them, but then the result is amazing. And I think the podcast itself now is like really a whole much bigger than the sum of its parts. Through 4 seasons, we have, I think, more than 40 episodes. And it brings together like really diverse voices. I find it's becoming a sort of who's who of local activists, as well as connecting us with amazing work that's happening abroad. And so what we're going to do in this panel is just reflect a little bit on the process and listen to our students about what the interviewing process was like, as well as what they learned. I've been spending the week grading or reading people's final self-evaluations, so I know that they have these really amazing insights about what they got out of the project. And again, just before proceeding, I do want to give a thank you to Naomi Frost, who was our wonderful TA and who really gave students a lot of guidance, as well as to the people who volunteered to be interviewed, who gave our students their time, but also their experiences. And then I also want to thank the Keener Committee, Ala, Raya, Paula, Dave, Francois, and Bria, who did an amazing job coordinating this event. So what we're going to do, the format we're going to use is we're going to have 2 little conversations like this. So we've split the class into 2. So this is panel 1. And I have 2 questions for you guys. One is, what were the sort of lessons and challenges you got out of the process of doing this interview project? And the second question is about what you learned from your person. Like, what's your big takeaway? And so just before doing that, I'm going to introduce each team. Oh, this is where I have to do the clicker. There we go. Team number one was Dave.
It's okay. No professionals. It's good.
Devin and Paula. So Dave and Paula are right here, and they interviewed Maite Labrec-Saganesh, who's quite a prominent Indigenous activist and sometimes politician. Group number two, there we go, was Sam, Sarah Luz, and Naya, and they interviewed SCPA alum extraordinaire, Jay Salos Carter, who's now a law student and has worked a lot in the defund the police movement. Group number three was Marianne, Sean, and Francois, who interviewed SCPA prof, Anna Krasinski, who's been really involved in neighborhood activism in Point St. Charles, particularly around Bâtiment 7. And group number four, represented by Adam here and Ava, interviewed Angelica, and I'm going to butcher her last name, Antonakopoulos, who is a Concordia student and a member of ASFA, the Association of Arts and Science Federation of Associations, who talked a lot about strike organizing last year. And then I was told, go to the next slide. Yay. So I'm gonna pass it over to you guys and maybe start by talking about, again, the process of doing the oral history interviews and you know, what was fun about it and what was challenging about it, et cetera. Dave, do you wanna?
Sure.
This thing work? All right. So yeah, thank you, Anna, for the whole semester. It was really fun. Putting together a podcast is not something that you kind of get the chance to do very often. And for myself, I'm an avid podcast listener. So you get to see behind the scenes of how actually complicated it is to sort of, not only the technical aspects of putting together a podcast, like on your computer or whatever, but I was the one giving the interview in our group, and it's really difficult to give an interview to like stick to your talking points, be involved with the person face to face, sort of trying to guide the conversation where you want it to go, but like pick up on the topics that you brought to the interview to begin with. So I was lucky to have Paula and Devin beside me on this little roundtable discussion we had, because I would pause at some point, like looking at my sheets, what questions to ask next and everything. And you guys would speak up sometimes too about questions that you wanted to pose. So that was my biggest challenge, was actually like giving this interview and sort of trying to get the most out of it. I don't know if you had something you wanted to bring to it as well?
Well, you did a fantastic job, I think. So that might have been your biggest challenge, but you overcame it. I thought you did a really good job. And you have a voice for radio. You should make more podcasts.
Not a face.
No, that's not what That's true. That is an insult. That was the biggest challenge. All of it was a challenge because I really had no idea what we were doing when we went into it. I loved our interviewee. I'm very thankful that Devin came up with her. It's funny, since I started the CPA, I've said this before, every project or assignment I seem to do leans towards Indigenous issues. I think maybe it's at the forefront in Canada right now, but it's at the forefront in my brain as well. And Maite is fantastic. She is very engaged and had a lot to say. Her father was a survivor of residential school, so she had a lot of insights about that. I'll talk about that later, I suppose. But the entire thing was quite the challenge. And I think in the end, we came up with something, pretty good. And teamwork. Anna says that SCPA is a degree in teamwork, and it takes an adjustment to know your teammates, to know how they work, to just because they didn't respond to you for 2 days doesn't mean they've dropped off the edge of the planet. So, it all came together in the end, and it was a very exciting process.
Yeah, I guess Dave touched on this a little bit, but I would say a big challenge for the oral history interview aspect of it was kind of being able to let your ego go, because I know a lot of planning on our part went into the questions specifically, and you'd have a really well-written, amazing question that you would want to ask, but the conversation just wasn't flowing that way. So you had to just like put your ego aside a little bit and be like, it's fine, I'll think of something else. Yeah.
I think that our group specifically, when we were interviewing, we would be making these faces at each other, like, okay, you go, or like, I'm gonna go, or like, give me a minute, like, I have something I wanna say, or like, we can take turns, and that really helped with the interview process. Definitely something that like I struggled with was like finding a person, because that's so important, because that's what the interview is based on. And Sam came in clutch finding Jay. So that made the whole process a lot easier, because it was very easy to find things to talk about, and we had a lot of ideas that we bounced around, and it all came together.
Yeah, I don't know. The conversation was just really easy, I feel like. I really like working with you guys. We've done a lot of work together. You guys are awesome. And Jay's awesome, of course. I don't know. I think I felt, for me, it felt like doing the interview was kind of a breeze. And maybe that was just because, I don't know, we were all so excited to do it, or because we all know each other. But I think that, I think that the biggest challenge maybe for us was like, I don't know. I suppose we didn't really have any major challenge. I think this just went really well. Yeah.
For us too, the interview went really well with Anna, and maybe for me the biggest challenge was like not to engage too much in the conversation, because it's oral history, so the person have to speak and you have to let go of like what you want to say, and so it was difficult to not being like in the conversation too much and just like, wait, I'm gonna just let her finish what she's saying instead of just adding up. But it was really interesting though.
Yeah, for my group, it like getting Angelica to talk about the tuition hikes was a really obvious choice, in the sense of it's something she helped out. She helped out organizing the strikes a lot last year. She talked to the press a lot last year, so there were a lot of photos of her online. And she was also like a personal friend of mine. I think like the biggest issue my group had was finding the time. Both Angelica and I have been very busy this semester, and she's also a STEM student. And so actually finding the time between all of our extracurricular activities and for it to line up with everything was a really big issue. And yeah, I'd also like to echo what one of the previous groups said about not like adding on to what the interviewee was saying, because during the course of the interview, she referred to some things that I was like, oh, I can add this, but then I was like, no, should not do that. It's not my interview.
Thank you guys for that first round of answers. I have to say, I feel a little bit vindicated hearing you guys talk about the teamwork, because I feel like every time I introduce this project, I hear the students groan of like, oh my God, another team project. But this thing about like being able to rely on each other, and like, yeah, when I can't think of a question, I know the other one will ask a question or whatever, is to my mind a lifesaver when doing something like this. So I'm glad, at least for the examples of teamwork that worked well, and that, you know, we're not just torturing our SCPA students by making you do teamwork all the time. And another observation I wanted to make, I think I said this to the class, that this semester, of the 4 semesters we've done this, is the one that has had the most interviewees who are from the Concordia community, which I think is great. Like, I think it's really cool to see that we're exploring activism on our own campus, and also like you said, Adam, you know, it's stuff that you were involved in, so that you're able to bring those experiences into the classroom, I think is really nice, and I'm glad if that space exists. I will turn to the second question around what you learned from your person, like what's your takeaway, and is there anything that really marked you from speaking with your person?
Well, I don't know if you guys know who Maïti Lebrec-Saganash is. You might know her dad. He was an MP who told, I don't know the exact quote, but it was basically in the House of Commons, where he stood up and told Justin Trudeau that if he doesn't give a fuck about First Nations, he should just say it. That's who I I knew her dad from. But the interesting point that I learned out of this was that Canada is an apartheid state. I never thought of it like that before. And that was literally the last line of our interview. She came out and said that. I'm just like, oh fuck, I didn't think about that before.
Yeah, and it was very interesting having an Indigenous perspective to get into her head and understand how she perceives and lives her life as an Indigenous woman, and to understand totally why she say it's an apartheid state. I thought what she said was really interesting. It's in her quote. My father says that survived genocide, and all I got was a Gord Downey album and 12 lousy therapy sessions, which is a pretty good line. But she said something had a real insight into that, and that her father survived residential schools, and it obviously affected him in a very detrimental way. And she said that that generation is really too fucked up to entirely get out of it. That it was her generation that was going to have to, heal and move on, and that they weren't getting enough support to do so. And it really made me think, because we understand that, as far as something like genocide and the Holocaust, that the offspring, the progeny of Holocaust survivors are passed on as certain trauma as well and live with that trauma. But we don't think of that in terms of Indigenous people. I don't think many people do. And the extent to which she said that she thought it was a burden, or maybe more a responsibility for her generation to be able to bring up Indigenous people, to bring up her community and push forward, I thought was very interesting and very telling.
If I can just bounce off of it too, I think what's interesting about Maite is that she has worked both sort of inside and outside the system, right? So she talks about getting involved in provincial politics and it not working out for various reasons. She also talks about activism out in the community and the work she does in the community. And it's an interesting example because we talked about this so much in class, right? Like the various ways within institutions, outside of them. And anyway, I enjoyed listening to her reflections on that.
Her employment, what pays her rent, is working for the Cree Health Board. But she also writes a column for The Nation, the Cree newspaper, does public speaking. She's out there and does both. And it's interesting, too, that was insightful, what she considers activism and what she does not consider activism, to make that distinction. Listen to the interview.
I would say that one big thing that I learned while interviewing Jay would be to kind of look for the greatness within your own community, which sounds so whatever. But it's true. Even when we were looking for an activist, I would say that was a little bit of a challenge. We kind of we're scrounging around, and I know I was thinking, when you think activist, it's such a loaded question, and you're kind of oh, I don't know, we're the leaders of these movements, or maybe we could get a professor that's well known and we know is involved in these movements. But then Sam brought up the idea of interviewing Jay, someone who's directly in our SCPA community and who we know is involved in a plethora of movements. And while we were interviewing them, we were like, wow, this person has so much knowledge and it's really amazing. So, yeah.
I think that when I think of career paths, I think of them as very linear of if I'm going to be an activist, there is one way I'm going to do this, and I'm committed to this in that specific way for a really long time. But talking with Jay and just seeing the different projects that they were involved on and the different things that they wanted to support, there was so much diversity and variety, and it definitely changed my perspective on what a life of activism can include, because now they're a law student and they're going to be continuing this activism in a different way. And just seeing all of the different paths that they've taken was really enlightening to me.
I think for me, what stood out most was the way that activism doesn't just mean being vocal in the street for a certain cause. It can also mean caring for your community. And in the interview we talked about the Occupy Wall Street, the way that people were supporting each other and the way that people were bringing food for each other, and we saw that somewhat this summer in Montreal. But it also extends to things like the Defund the Police Festival, where it's like creating a safe space for members of the community is also a way of doing meaningful activist work. And I just thought that was really cool.
Thank you.
Yeah, with Anna, we talked a lot about like organizing with different communities and like different groups and challenges with that. But the thing that really stuck for me was that social movement and like social activist groups, sometimes they die and it's okay. And sometimes you have to let go. And that was super meaningful because I feel like I lived that before, but didn't quite understand why there was all of these like tense meeting and people were still trying to organize together, but it's not the same period and people have moved on. But she really explained like, you have to let go, you have to do a last meeting and like a funeral of the movement. And in that way, people are gonna still work in the same issue, but without all of the unuseful like discourse and everything. So it was like really interesting of like, yeah, it's kind of something dies and it's okay, but we're still gonna fight for the cause, but differently.
Thank you. I think a big thing I learned from Angelica was she also had the same feelings that she had been sort of like used by people in power in the context of last year. Because in her interview, she had said that the Concordia administration, I believe a few months ago, had basically been like, okay, cool students, you did your thing. We're gonna try to like get the international out-of-province tuition hike overthrown in court. I don't think that's ever worked. Stuff like that usually doesn't get resolved in court, but hopefully we'll see. But she also felt a lot of us had reflections that, okay, how did they treat us differently versus what's going on now with Palestine? And we're like, okay, they treated us differently because they were very much in, we can use this to our advantage. This accelerates our political agenda. We're gonna like, obviously in court, we're gonna be like, look, our students were on strike for over a week in the last semester, and they're mad at you guys they're mad at you, the CAQ government, for doing the international out-of-province tuition hike. And so, yeah, I think that was a big thing that we learned, that both Ava and I learned from Angelica, was that these feelings of almost like betrayal by the Concordia administration are valid.
Can I ask just a little follow-up question to the two groups that interviewed people they knew well? Do you feel like you learned new things about your person?
Oh, absolutely. I thought I knew Jay. But I mean, there was just like, if you listen to the interview, you'll get, I feel like, a pretty good sense of their life story. And that none of that had ever been exposed to me. So that was just it was nice.
Yeah, just, everyone has these things that in life, obviously, you can only tell so many things. And then when we're spending time dedicated, not of a conversation where, oh, you have this cool story, I have this cool story that I relate. It's like, I'm not going to talk about me because this is all about you, really gives you a sense of this person, because every word that they say, you're really listening to, because you're thinking of, okay, what is the next question I can ask that doesn't, ask what you already said, but also I'm trying to like internalize this information. And it's just a really learning opportunity for sure.
Yeah, I definitely feel that I learned from Jay, and not even only just from them, but also about these movements. I didn't even really know about the Occupy Wall Street movement, and so yeah, that was very interesting to learn about.
Yeah, I know Angelica pretty well. I think the maybe not learn, but I was reminded that a year ago, from when we had initially recorded the interview, she had significantly fewer piercings, which is what she mentioned in her interview. And I was just like, oh my God, I remember I remember this phase of your activism. Yeah.
Getting piercings.
Well, yes, and before that.
Thank you. Before we wrap up with this panel, or with this group, do you guys have anything else you want to add about what you took away from it or what you learned? You're like, please let me go sit down. Well, thank you guys.
You got something, Sam?
No, I better not.
I'm going to invite all the folks who haven't presented yet to come out, and you guys can go relax. So do you want to sit it out then? It's up to you.
I don't know. I was gonna say, because I have to go to my radio show.
Yeah. If you want, do the first one and then just sit it out.
They're not putting like the PowerPoint on the other side and they're filming, there's no need to move to the last slide. Okay. I think it'd be interesting to let them maybe ask them about the quote at some point so they can read it out or not. Or at this.
So round two. Oh, sorry. The first group has went to get themselves food for a job well done. So I will introduce now the other teams. So, and I'm not sure what order these are in. Okay, I don't think we have anyone speaking from this group, but we had two students, Samia and Kiana, who did an interview with Kobe Rogers Hall, who's an artist, an activist, especially on migrant justice questions, and also actually a prof in SCPA. Do we have anyone from that group either? No. So we had three students, Lena, Zachary, and Yusuf, who interviewed Zayad Abisab, who's a Palestinian activist and especially was involved in Concordia SPHR. We had Bria, Mateo, and Ryan, all of whom are here, who interviewed Mia Kennedy, another SCPA student, about her activism around questions of food security and insecurity. We had Raya and Ala, who are here, and some of the organizers of this event, who interviewed Hiyam Barakat about her own Palestinian activism and sort of life story. We had Alexandra, Sophia, and Terry, who interviewed Mustafa Henaway, who's another friend of SCPA, who's another migrant justice activist, works at the Immigrant Workers Center, and is also completing a PhD here. We had Camila, who's here, Tanya, and Antonio interview Nelly, who's an activist with Climate Justice Montreal. And Elfie and Julian interviewed Adiel Cohen, who's an Israeli Jewish peace activist. So, look at that. So I will start with the same questions and encourage you guys to talk about what you learned from the process of interviewing and either what was great about it or what was challenging or both.
For sure. So, I mean, for me personally, Mia's a great friend of mine. So it was really, it was really easy and efficient to just, communicate with her and figure out a time and place to actually hold the interview. And so that was really nice. I think the one thing that was challenging for me is actually the logistics of editing and really going through a podcast, right? Like it's the first time I've interacted with apps like the ones I use to edit the audio, and so that was for sure a hassle I had to go through. But the rest was pretty it flowed pretty well. Yeah.
Same here. I knew Mia through SCPA 201 and then 215 as well. So it was good to interview someone you already you already knew, you already had classes with. So it was more organic. It flowed well. Obviously, we faced our difficult. I know the sound was sometimes problematic, and we had some trouble with some of the written portion of the assignment. But ultimately, I think we really enjoyed the result, and we were glad it was someone like Mia. We had the opportunity to interview someone we knew, and therefore it was more organic and it flowed better. And I think we had a good conversation.
Yeah, agree with what you guys were saying. Like a big challenge was even just scheduling within the group, trying to find times that work for everyone. And yeah, it was great to get to know some of my peers because I'm new to the school, so that was good. It's good to get to know Mia. And learn about her cause and
So we had a lot of struggle finding someone to interview. We were pretty ambitious for our first choice. We were trying to get Jane Goodall for our interview, but that after I was able to email her secretary, and it seemed like promising, but unfortunately that fell through. A lot of our interviewees that we were hoping for fell through. So we ended up having a backup plan. Thankfully, Julian found Adiel Cohen, who we finally ended up interviewing really recently, actually. But it's done.
Yeah, it was definitely going through the people who we were originally going to interview was definitely a process. But I don't know, I thought our interview, it was very different than I think what we were initially expecting. I actually met Adiel I guess a little over a month now in the Hall building during a tabling event he did. I'd heard of him originally through some work I had previously done, some stuff that he had kind of cooperated with in the past. When we got to sit down with him, he agreed to sit down with us for an hour, and our interview went on for about 2 hours. It was a really engrossing and valuable conversation, and I think it really challenged a lot of our perspectives and our positions on the issue, and it's very interesting to conduct that.
Thanks. I think this project is interesting because it's not just an assignment with clear guidelines. There's a lot of creativity and a lot of decision making in it, and I think that's the part that I struggled with the most because I personally went into this course thinking, okay, we're going to learn about collective action and what's the best way to inspire it and what's the best way to go about it in an effective manner. And I wanted my project to align with that. And because of the fact that it's also oral history, you don't know what the person's going to say. You don't know what sort of conclusions you're going to get out of it. You don't know how to frame your questions to get to that purpose. And so we also had an interviewee that canceled on us because from the start we knew we wanted to interview a Palestine activist and women especially because we wanted to kind of give inspiration to everybody so that they could join in on the action and also kind of honor them and the people that I knew that did a lot of work. And when we were trying to find an interviewee, we got canceled on, and it was hard to predict what the stories were going to be, and then it was hard to edit to know exactly what we're getting at. And what I learned at the end is just honestly, it always falls through. If you keep in mind what you want to accomplish with the assignment and with the project, the pieces fall together so it does that. And I think it ended up being a very inspiring piece, and it also honored her experiences and her legacy.
Yeah, for sure. And this is my first time doing an assignment that not only just impacted me, but it impacted other people's lives as well. It was my first time really dealing with a situation where someone's perception and what they're gonna put on the world really matters. And it was my first time having to deal with, the way people grew up, what people are doing now, this actually affects them. I don't think I've ever done an assignment before where it impacts anyone but me and my grades. So this is my first time where I'm showcasing someone else's story, and that really hit me. And I had to understand when we're asking questions to people if they can come on the podcast, we have to be aware of what we're bringing up, and we have to be aware of how we're asking them. And that was really a big learning curve for me, and it was honestly a great learning experience. And I'm really grateful for this assignment because it made me realize, wow, I am perceived in this world, and I have an impact. Mm-hmm. That is amazing. That's great to know.
Hello. Well, with my two other colleagues, we did a podcast on Nelly, who worked for Climate Justice Montreal. It was a insightful experience. At first, the interview didn't go very well because she struggled to open up, but with time, we had the chance to learn more about her. The big struggle for me is I'm a journalist, and I was working with two other people, and it was kind of difficult to, I wouldn't say delegate, but like guide them to like the good path, I guess. So like I always try to like shut up and let them do the interview because it was the first time that they were interviewing, and I wanted them to really thrive and enjoy the experience because it's just, I think it's a great experience for everyone. So yeah.
Thank you. And I'll just note, yeah, Camila has to run off because she is hosting a radio show on CJLO this afternoon. But I'm glad you were able to speak a little bit. Yeah, thank you guys for these reflections. And I have to say, like reflecting on what Raya said, that something that I think has been the case in all 4 semesters that I've taught this course, and certainly I really felt from you guys this semester, is acknowledging the sense of responsibility that comes with this stuff. Like, students sort of intrinsically get that they don't want to mess it up, and that like it's something to be putting someone's story out in the world. And so it's I'm glad if that's a meaningful learning experience, because I do think it's really important. And so then I'll ask you guys again the same second question. What was your big takeaway from the interview, or what did you learn? And if you want, even you each submitted a favorite quote. You could talk about what you got out of that quote or whatever.
Well, the person that we were interviewing, Mia, she's a student activist, and for me personally, I'm also involved in student activism, and I feel like a lot of the times in those spaces, you sort of put your head down and you just work towards a goal. You really time doesn't really stop, and having these moments where you're really able to sit down and talk to other people in the community about the realities that we're all facing as student activism is something that you can take comfort in, and you can also like reflect on your own experience and improve on those experiences. And so with Mia, it was very much talking about the struggles of what it is to when you're a student, you graduate, you sort of leave these things behind. We were both at Dawson, and so how do you really reconcile with the knowledge that you might go away and everything that you've worked towards might disappear or be handed off to people that you don't necessarily have a lot of faith in. And so that was the biggest thing. The other thing would be just navigating balancing career and activism is the biggest thing. I mean, if you hear the interview, we really talk about Mia wants to become a lawyer, but she's also very involved in activism, and there's a lot of ethics to take into account. And so all of these things are very valuable to talk about, and I feel like it should be a broader, more normalized sort of discussion, right? Yeah.
For sure. Like, I think my biggest takeaway was just how personable it was. Like, when it comes to like activism and just activists in general, like I consider myself, kind of like on the outside looking in. So to have the opportunity to like chat with someone that first of all is in your program and is like your age and talk about activism and talk about work that is considered activism or just work for like just to help the community is obviously, like, I'm not unfamiliar with it, but just to talk about it firsthand with someone who's done it firsthand is a really great opportunity to further educate yourself on activism and what might be considered activism and just overall like community betterment. So I learned a lot from her, and I'm glad we had a conversation like that. And it really goes to show, like, it can be your best friend, it can be someone that just is doing the work, and it's good to see that it's everywhere around you, especially in Montreal.
Yeah, I kind of had 2 big takeaways. So the first one was we talked a lot about like being in university, working, like sometimes you can experience burnout, and she kind of just explained that there's like always something you can do. Like there's always something you can do. There's always something you can make a little bit of time for, like kind of thing. So she was just kind of talking about different things she's done when she's really busy. And then the other takeaway was like I found during the interview, I'd be like, oh no, like edit that out. Like, and I was very like, no, like, but it's like, use your voice. Like, these are issues and we need to talk about them. Like, we don't need to edit this out and stuff like that. So that was really cool too. I feel like she kind of helped me find my voice.
Yeah, so for our interviewee, I guess one of the biggest challenges was just interviewing him. I was really hesitant at first because I know he has a lot of differing opinions than my own. So the interview itself was challenging to even do. A lot of what he said I disagreed with, and I was oftentimes very like emotionally distraught during the interview, but I had to stay on track and let him speak and continue posing the questions. And I'm very happy that Julian was there because he was kind of in a way a moderator between him and I, because at times things would get a bit heated. So it was definitely an interesting experience since it wouldn't have been my first pick, but ultimately I'm glad that we interviewed someone that has a differing opinion than me. Yeah.
Yeah, I think my big takeaway from the interview was that people who are living through these realities on the ground, who are engaged with this kind of work, won't necessarily have perspectives or solutions that we would consider traditional or standard necessarily. I think from when I had first briefly talked to him in the hall versus our much longer interview, I think we could have even compiled a whole second episode just with the stuff that we took out. There was so much that we went into. But it wasn't what I was expecting. It really challenged the way I have traditionally thought about the issue. And I think, like for me, that was the big takeaway, is that for someone who's actually going through, especially who's not receiving information from just media like online, who's actually living through the stuff here and now, his perspectives really challenged what I would consider a very traditional model of the issue. And for me, that was the big takeaway.
I think it's a very hard thing to navigate when you're producing oral history. Is how do you place yourself as the person asking the question and the person trying to convey a story? And as I said, like for our team, we had decided that we wanted to do this like inspiration and honoring the activist. However, when you look at the bigger picture of society, not to get huge and philosophical, but I think activists are the people who have values, that have beliefs, that are built by experiences, by critical thinking, and that go and do something about it. They go and they try to improve the situation, right? And then whatever values and actual goals and movements that you strive for, and whether when you listen to an activist you agree with them or not, it's not always the case. You don't always agree with them. But what we can get out of these podcasts and out of these stories is just at least be people with values and then go act about them. And then how do you always do your best to remain authentic throughout it? And I think that's what I ended up learning the most from the interviews, because she's so brave and authentic. And the quote that we picked is, she said, "I'll sacrifice everything." And I know I've already sacrificed my teenagehood, my innocence as a young girl, and that's the reality of it. Is when you're an activist, you will make sacrifices, but you're doing it for something that you believe in, and that's what being an activist is, I think.
For sure, I think my coworker Anna said it perfectly. But I will have to say, one thing I did learn was that she said it so nicely. She said, I may be viewed as an activist, but I more feel like I'm part of a movement. And I think that was really nicely said. When exactly as Ada said, the experiences that you have, the opinions that you make are all from who you are and how you grew up and what your values are. And being part of that movement, it's not just about you anymore. It's not about just one person. It's like she was almost representing everyone around her that was experiencing the same things. And I think that was very beautiful to see, and I think that was incredible to learn about, that activism, it can be someone's identity as well. It can be someone's their identity shapes their activism, and activism shapes them, and I think that's really important. I thought that was beautiful to learn.
Thank you. If I can ask one last little question, I feel like this came up in some of your comments. Some of you have said this to me in class, and I hear this in the comments that were made in both panels, that some of the students in the class are very involved in activist work. Others said like, oh, I don't know that I had much to contribute because it's not really my world, but that it's interesting to learn from the outside in. Like, how did your feeling of either being an insider or an outsider in these interviews impact your experience? If anyone, that's just open, if anyone wants to answer.
Kind of answer. Yeah, I was kind of speaking to that when I answered. Well, just from like my personal experience, like I'm new to Montreal, I'm new to the school, and so like I feel like back home I was a lot more involved in things, and this is what I talked about like off camera with Mia, is like I just kind of feel like I don't even know how to explain it, like guilty almost, because like I'm just like so overwhelmed this semester, like, and just trying to kind of find my place in Montreal and in the school and everything. And that's kind of when she was like, even if you can just do the smallest thing kind of thing. So that's kind of what I'm going to work on next semester. And I don't really know if that answered the question, but like, it's just, yeah, it was really interesting, like hearing from a firsthand perspective, like all the movements she's done and how she's got to where she is. And it was really inspiring. So I was like, I'm ready to get more involved in Quebec. And yeah.
It was like redesign.
Yeah, and I was like, what design?
Scene.
Or scene.
Lord, oh, there we go.
Because I'm just like new to everything. I just feel like this little Martian. So everything is new and exciting to me.
I think we can both say that after our interview, we're like, damn, she's too cool. She's too great. She's doing a lot. And I can relate a lot to what Bria, like you articulated perfectly, is when you're talking to people and you're in class and you're hearing all the wonderful things that people have said, you feel both guilty and inspired. You're both like, oh my God, these people have dedicated their entire lives and I have done nothing in comparison. And yeah, you can be realistic about it and say, no, I'm busy or I'm doing whatever. I think it's just try to do your best. Try to be the best citizen that you can be. Try to, stand by what you believe in. Don't be like, oh no, today's not the day that I'm doing my activism. Like for example, if it's like climate, today I will do the exact opposite of what I believe in, and it's fine. It's just because I got lazy. I won't trier mes déchets. I don't know. That's the only thing I can think about. It's not activism, but you know what I mean. It's inspiring, and it's maybe sometimes good from time to time to get a little hit of, I should be doing more.
Thank you.
Last comment, if I may. My parents always, like every time I ask my dad, I'm like, Baba, what can I do? What can I do to help? And he's like, Raya, this is above our pay grade. But now, after this class, I realized, activism isn't like you absolutely changing the world. It can be those small things. It can be those choices you make every day. And, now I'm kind of happy. I think my parents were once very resilient, but I think life kind of broke them down. But I'm going to try to bring that spirit back up in them, trying to, bring the activism out of them. So that's what I took out of this, and that's what I learned from this class as well.
Oh, sorry. I was just going to say one more comment that I was talking about Mia after. She said, like, the fact that you're asking these questions too, and the fact that you're here is doing something too. So I'm like, that kind of stuck with me a lot too.
I think Julian wanted to.
Oh, sorry.
No problem. Yeah, as I said earlier, Adiel and I first heard about Adiel because I worked for an organization or worked with an organization that he had also been a part of. And even though I don't agree with him on a number of issues, there was something over the course of the interview where I was thinking, it's kind of remarkable that even though we don't agree on this, that we were still engaged in the same work. And I don't know, something kind of reassuring that even through political division, that when there's a goal and there's a solid goal that you're trying to achieve, that people can put that aside to work together towards that. So I don't know, I found that powerful, meaningful.
Thank you. I'm happy to open it up to the audience if there are no other comments, either on Zoom. I don't know how many people are even on Zoom, or here, even if classmates want to ask each other questions.
There are some people on Zoom, and I'll just mention again, if you do have any questions there, just pop them into the chat and we can read them out. And here in the spaces, raise your hand, thank you, and we'll bring a mic over.
Famous SCPA alum, Jay Salos Carter, go ahead.
Hello, friends. Thank you so much for presenting. Great job, and I'm excited to look at listen to some of the work you've done. I guess the question I have for you is we've talked a lot about how you're engaging with activism as part of this class, but another part of it is engaging with oral history. So I wonder if anybody has like any feelings like, what does what is it to you, or like how have you engaged with it, or how has your vision of it changed throughout the process of this class?
Thank you, Jay. And I'll note as we take questions, if folks from the first panel want to answer, feel free to come up and take the mic as well. Yeah. Anyone?
I can speak on that. Sure. Well, I mean, the first thing that pops up in my head when thinking about oral history is institutional knowledge, right? A lot of the things that support activism through and through is what remains of certain events and events that have happened throughout, for example, Concordia's history, right? If you look at the marking things that have impacted the fight last year on tuition hikes, it's especially the stuff that came out of 2012, right? All of those podcasts, all of those radio shows, all of those written testimonies, right? They're all so incredibly important to the future of activism. So that's how I see oral history, especially, I work at ASFA, the Arts and Science Federation of Associations, and one of the biggest things that I got from there is you need to keep everything that you've done throughout the year for the people that will come after, and look at that Google Drive and look for tidbits of information here or there, look for tidbits of knowledge and reassurance. Reassurance is the biggest thing. So that's how I see oral history.
As a historian, I really love that answer. I just wanted to add, I think it was in the first panel when folks were talking about their interview with you, Jay. I can't remember who said that they'd never really heard of Occupy or didn't know much about it until you talked about it, right? And that's something that I'm learning a lot in my own research, is activist movements can be very transient. And so even intergenerational change happens within 5 years. So that ability to capture stuff, because otherwise it just disappears, is so important.
And building that back up is so incredibly hard. I've been part of building that stuff back up, and it's labor that you wish would have been done beforehand. Yeah.
I think oral history is how you get people to care, because that's how you get people to know each other. Personally, my only experience with oral history before was I participated in a podcast that was part of a larger Montreal podcast that was done per arrondissement, and they were doing portraits of citizens in the quartier and stuff, and I was one of them. And afterwards, I listened to the other podcast, and I was like, Montreal is my city, and I care for the people here. I know who's here, and I love them all. I've heard them. I know, Jean-Michel from Rosemont, and I know, it was every type of person and every type of face. And when you hear their stories, that's when you get to care about them. And it can be tough to empathize with somebody who you don't know. And in the age that we're at right now, it's also very easy to be desensitized to what you see on your phone. And oral history is one way where you will remain sensitive. You're hearing people's voices, you're hearing their emotion. It's a form of art, and I think another challenge for us, people who want to document that and raise awareness, is how to make it more accessible to the newer generations. So, you put your podcast up on Spotify, but you also make a reel out of it. You also make a TikTok out of it. And I'm curious to see where oral history will go in the future.
Yeah, I was going to say in answer to what you asked, Jay, oral history is a bit of a misnomer for this project, really, because a lot of it isn't history. A lot of it's current. I mean, you spoke about things we've been involved in the past, but really it's more sort of oral testimony. And it made me think about the reading that we've done in class, how I think it's by Pertelli, about oral history, and how what they're talking about is how they see it in the moment. Now, if it was history, it'd be interesting to see 10, 20 years from now, how they would analyze it in the future. I've worked as an activist in the past, and certainly what I believed and what I thought was happening at the time isn't necessarily how I see it now. So it'd be interesting if we could do, not saying we should, but I should do it 10 years from now. How do you see what you talked about then? How do you see it now? Because it really would be oral history as a looking 20/20 hindsight, looking back at what they were talking about then. How do they say it now?
I am happy to email you all in 10 years and say, let's do round two. I suspect no one will answer my
Yes.
email.
Feel free to ask.
But I will say, I mean, I agree, and I think what's kind of neat, if you thought about all the different people we went through, and then also the other 3 seasons of the podcast, is some of you interviewed sort of young people who are at the beginning of their work, and some people have 30 years experience. And indeed, it's so interesting to contrast the reflections if they're in the now or if they're talking about stuff in the past. Yeah. François, did you want
to? Hi. I would say the oral history project, I think the most interesting thing is kind of something that all of my other peers talked about, was about centering individuals within movements and kind of putting a face on all of these like monoliths that we've created for ourselves. It's, I think, one of the greatest narrative tools for writing a villain in a story is like parallelism, which is like the idea that you made the same decisions as the villain in the story, but at some point in time, they made a different choice and it went a different way. And I think this is kind of how you get to, well, not that the activists were villains, but seeing the decisions behind their thoughts kind of humanizes the experience, and you see yourself within them and you're like, oh, these are the thoughts that I had. How do I deal with movements dying, like Marianne said? How do I center myself within Montreal, like Bria said? And just moving forward with those thoughts and living through someone else's experience gives you that path forward. And I think that's the most interesting part about the oral history project for me.
Thank you. Do we have time for one more question?
We do have a question on Zoom. It's probably more of a focused one on it. And I'll read it out. It's from Lorraine. Lorraine says, hi, this is great. What is the difference between a podcast, which is edited and shaped, and oral history interviews, which may not be edited?
Do you guys want to speak to that? So I gave the students speeches many times in the class being like, you have to edit this. And a lot of you, after you did your interviews, were like, that was 3 hours long. And I'm like, yeah, you got to edit it. And we, you know, it's about preparing a long conversation that's like really beautiful, but preparing it for public consumption in a way that, you know, people will actually listen to you. But if you remember, I gave everyone lectures about like, you still have to get to know the person, right? Like, so how do you keep whatever was so insightful about that long interview and put it into something that's more digestible for a general audience? I don't know if any of you have reflections on what that was like.
Well, like, I mean, obviously we had to edit it, but the goal was always to make sure it was organic and that it flowed. And I think everyone here had an organic and a podcast interview, whatever, and it flowed. And, you know, what some people said, you know, your guys' went on for 2 hours, right? So there's a lot of content, a lot of information. Even if edits need to be made, like, a lot is spoken about, it flows, and I think there's a lot of takeaways for many people that are involved. So while yes, it's not, you know, not complete raw oral history, it's still, like, the principle of it is there.
Yeah, I would say for us, the beginning of our interview was kind of awkward because we were like introducing each other, trying to like get the momentum going. And so we cut out a lot of the beginning of our podcast, of our episode, because it just didn't feel like it was flowing naturally. And also, there were a lot of times that we just cut out where we were just saying, constantly. So when someone hears that, it doesn't sound the most eloquent. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, there's definitely a lot of editing, also pulling from different parts of the interview, because during our interview, Adiel would say a sentence or a phrase or something, and we would do a follow-up, and we'd be like, what did you mean by this? Or can you elaborate more or expand on this idea? And so we would get really into certain ideas. And listening back, it's like, well, there's so much material to cover, so much stuff that's important. We really had to get out a lot of that stuff. And I think that kind of in a way is to the detriment of podcasts a little bit. At the beginning of the semester, I went back and I listened to an oral history that my grand uncle, I'm named after, gave. I forget which museum, but he had done like 5 hours worth of, you know, pure unedited testimony over 3 episodes with this museum. And that's just not something we could do because we have a time constraint, and you really need to get to the core of what is this person saying and why is it important and why is it important for the audience. And so it's a much more targeted process. than I think just a traditional oral history or testimony. And so, yeah, there's that good and there's that bad. I think maybe the preferred format would be you had the podcast and then you would have the unedited testimony under it so people could listen to the full thing. Yeah, I mean, that was definitely a process of trying to figure out what parts are we going to include, what parts are we taking out, what nuances do we need to remove, what details should be kept in. If there's a reference to another question that was made, how do we make that flow elegantly? Much more, yeah, it's much more careful what you're including in a podcast for sure.
Do any other students want to comment on this, or? I think we're at time.
I was just gonna say,
yeah,
sorry.
Go ahead.
I was just gonna say, yeah, even like what you were speaking to, when we first answered the question, like we kind of, we kind of live in a generation where like everything is at our fingertips, and in that sense, like people don't have as many patience. So I think if we did release like a 3-hour podcast, I don't know if people would listen to it. And then like another thing with like the listening stations too is like that's why we kind of like got the like highlights of it, because we really want to get our points across, and that kind of what my other classmates were saying. Like it would be great if we could have like 3-hour podcasts, but it just might not be ideal for the kind of world we live in.
Thank you. Well, I think that's a perfect note to end on. Thank you, Bria. Thank you to all the students who spoke. And just to say, thank you to folks who joined on Zoom, and for folks who are here, we have the space for a little bit longer. There's a ton of falafel. And in the back here, there are listening stations where indeed the students have highlighted, like, if you want to just go to the like best part of the interview, the sort of time codes. So please do feel free to listen, mingle, and yeah, thank you all.
Thank you, Anna. Thanks, everyone. Thanks, team SCPA 352. We're going to be closing up the Zoom and a live stream now. And this conversation does remain available on our YouTube channel. You should revisit it. You should share it. But you should also check out this podcast and do that here in the listening stations. Okay. Thank you, everyone. Have a great afternoon.